Whoa. Wow. Won't do that again. Welcome, everybody. I'm sorry for the delay. We had technical difficulties at a technical conference. Can you imagine that? Close all that. Goodbye. Open this. Voila. Right. Okay, so my name is Josh Long. Hi. Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming. How was lunch? Yes. I'm a fan. A fat fan, even. Boy. So my name is Josh Long. That's my email. If you have questions, if you leave this room more confused than when you entered, now you have recourse. Send it there. I'm happy to help. I'm happy to hear it. And, hopefully you don't have so many questions, but just in case. And just as, I do this all the time. You leave a room, it's like, oh, wait, what about this? One thing or something. Lest I forget, can you guys say open source? Open source. Oh, that's hot. That's good stuff. Good stuff. You guys are great. I'm the author of 4 different books on Spring, 2 different videos. I'm a leading contributor of bugs to many of those fine, wonderful Spring projects. I'm also the idiot that tried to teach Jean-Claude Van Damme how to cloud compute. Not my best moment, not my best work, but I tried. Let's see. So I work for Pivotal. How many of you guys have heard of Pivotal? Oh, thank Buddha. So what happened was we had this company called SpringSource, and then they got bought up by VMware, and then we kind of took those open sourcey bits from SpringSource and from VMware, and we took Cloud Foundry, RabbitMQ, Redis, Tomcat, Grails, Groovy, Spring, of course, and put them all under one roof called Pivotal. It's an open source company dedicated to building and helping people build sort of modern applications, right, on a modern platform. When we started the company last year, April last year, but by the way, it's the same team is the point. This is SpringSource. It's the same group. If you hear people talking about Pivotal, same thing. It's not some weird consulting company that happens to be pretty good at Spring. It's actually the Spring people. And when we started last year, April last year, we said, well, we need to do better. We need to do more to simplify the development experience, We had a new lease on life, and that's a good thing. And so we said, well, what do we do to help improve the bootstrap experience in particular, the getting started and delivering results experience? How do we do that? And part 1, of course, is improve documentation. So we built a brand new website. If you go to springsource.org, you'll get redirected to spring.io. This is our new home on the web. It has all the usual things, the blogs, the forums, and all that stuff. But my favorite thing is the website, or these guides, rather. So we go to spring.io, guides. Oh, guys, by the way, as somebody who spends a lot of time bouncing around conferences and eating conference food and relying on conference Wi-Fi, I am particularly pleased with this conference. So these guides are all sort of 10 to 15 minute long introductions to diverse topics on diverse things, sometimes in terms of Spring, sometimes in terms of things that people working with Spring will need to know about if they're not, even if they're not necessarily directly related to Spring. So for example, if you want to talk to a database using JDBC, sure, there's a tutorial on that, for example, or a little guide. Whoops, that was a little too quick, thank you. If you go to any one of these tutorials, you'll see that there's no magic, right? We explain everything. I mean, everything. The build structure, the folders, the code snippets, everything you're going to need to be able to get started. They're all backed by GitHub repositories where you can check your work and see the finished example, as well as sort of a empty directory structure that you can kind of use to fill in the lines if you want. Or you can just start from scratch. Again, there's no magic. There's no assumption of anything. And the nice part about that is, from 0 to 15 minutes, you should have an idea of how to do one thing and one thing well. We provide 2 build files, a Gradle and a Maven one. We put the best foot forward, of course, so we use Gradle on the website, but there's always a Maven one in the GitHub repository. And then we explain what we're going to do and how to do it and what it's going to look like and how to use the code. And all of these examples, most of them anyway, use Spring Boot. So if you want to talk to Facebook or Twitter, you want to use RabbitMQ or a JMS directory, or you want to use JPA or Neo4j or MongoDB, or you want to build an Android app, or you want to consume REST services from iOS or from Android or from Sencha or for jQuery or for Angular.js. There are guides for all of this. So I wholly encourage you all to check them out if you can. The website itself is also an open source project, right? So the thing you're looking at right now is actually, it's called Project Sagan. It's on GitHub. And it's a Spring application running on top of Cloud Foundry, our open source platform as a service. So if you get a chance to check it out, please do. So that was part one. That was definitely a big first step, right? And then we said, okay, well, good. We got the documentation story better. Next, let's improve the sort of logical understanding. Because what we discovered was a lot of people look at Spring and they say, well, Spring, there's that core framework. It's got support for AOP and JDBC and Hessian and Burlap, but they don't really know about all the other bits. And they sometimes talk about these other bits in terms of like as though they're separate projects, which of course is, you know, an artificial sort of boundary. These are solutions for vertical domains, right? So if you want to do integration or batch processing or hypermedia-based REST services or you know, any of these kinds of solutions, we have separate projects. We don't keep them inside of the core Spring framework because they move faster. They have different use cases. They have different domains. Our project Spring Social, for example, services, you know, I want to consume an OAuth secured REST service use case. Well, I mean, I don't know if you've looked around, but the OAuth secured services out there like Facebook and Twitter and GitHub and Gowalla and all these things, they move very quickly. We can't afford to wait for every Spring release to go, you know, before we can include that. Same thing for data. MongoDB and Cassandra and Redis and Hadoop. You can't wait for a new brand new Spring release just to include the updated versions of this. So we separated them out in separate projects. That doesn't mean they're of any less quality or they're built by the same people, you see? So we wanted people to start thinking about it in terms of this broader holistic picture. We call that picture Spring I/O. Here's a pretty architecture diagram. Spring I/O, of course, describes three parts, or two parts rather, the execution layer. These are the things that we expect will manage processes. For example, Spring Boot, of course, that's what we're here to talk about today. Grails is a Groovy-powered web application framework. And then Spring XD is sort of our turnkey big data appliance. And then, of course, from those pieces, you can consume all the sort of libraries and you know, things that you have come to know and love. And as you'll see, we've even gone the extra step of sort of rationalizing all these different libraries, all the different versions of these libraries. So if you're using Spring I/O, you can just depend on Spring I/O. We actually have a BOM, a Maven, you know, bill of materials, POM, you know, a project that you can use from Gradle or whatever, that will have managed versions for all this stuff. You know, it doesn't import all this stuff, but if you, it's basically a magical dependency management section, okay? So if you want to use the new Spring, you want to use Spring Batch and Spring Integration, you have questions about which versions work with each, you know, with which ones. That was insane. If you have questions about which work with which ones, then it'll just be taken care of for you. And the implication is that if you update your Spring I/O BOM, you'll get the new versions, right? So if you move to Spring, you know, 10 or whatever, I don't know, arbitrary number here, right? We're at Spring 4 for those of you keeping count. But if you move to the next version, all the other versions will move with it, and you don't have to worry about integrating it and making it sort of sane. It doesn't bring everything onto your class path. Just be clear about that. It's still a la carte if you want it to be, right? Okay, and so Spring Boot is definitely how we imagine people will start with the Spring platform, with Spring I/O. Spring Boot is it's a chance to sort of pair program with the Spring developers. Think about it like that. It's a way to build applications. Woo! Excuse me. I wanted to go to my directory. Here we go. It's a chance to you know, build an application using Spring and assume that you've got sort of the common case scenarios already configured, you know. Spring is very flexible. That's one of its virtues. That flexibility has always implied some configuration, right, explicit configuration. And while that works, and while you still should have that configuration, we don't want it to be a burden. So we've said, well, what would Jürgen Haller do in this situation, the lead developer of Spring, you know? What would Dr. Sire do, the lead developer of Spring Batch? What would Oliver, the guy who's lead on Spring Data, what would he do? Why bother making everybody guess? Just provide common case configurations, okay? So Spring Boot is basically your chance to take advantage of these defaults. Can you guys see all this? This is a website here. It's called the Spring Initializer, start.spring.io. Oh boy, let's see, awkward. Kind of cropped, there you are. It's a little web service. It does nothing particularly fancy. You can go to start.spring.io, fill out the sort of pro forma information here, and you say, okay, what kind of application workload do I want to handle? What kind of thing do I want to build? Well, I want to build a web application, sure. I want to use Timeleaf, which is a templating library. How many of you are stuck on JSPs? It's okay, you're among friends. Don't be shy. It's okay. I give away hugs. The hugs are open source. I'm not kidding. I'm here for you. I'm here for you. So there's better ways to go forward. In fact, there's dozens of better ways to go forward. You could actually find in the street, just laying in the street, you could find a better way to do server-side rendering of templates than JSP. So don't feel shy about choosing a different one. Even if all you do is just render a page that then loads up Angular.js. I mean, don't even do that with JSP. You don't deserve it. You're better than that. Okay? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and build a sort of a simple application here. The idea is I want to build an application that manages bookings. You know, this is a stupid example. It's like OpenTable. I don't know if you have that here. It's an application you can use to make reservations at a restaurant. But we're not even going to do all that. We're just going to say, I want to have a record in the database that keeps a booking name, and that way we don't have to focus on the domain model at all. It's just nonsensically simple. So, bookings, please. And I'm going to go ahead and say I want to build a web app with Timeleaf support. I want to talk to JPA because why not? Common cases. I'll use REST repositories, maybe. I might use the remote shell. That's cool. I might want to talk to mobile or talk to Facebook, whatever, but not right now. I don't need Gemfire, Solar, or Redis, or Mongo for now. Don't need integration. Security might be nice. Actuator might be nice. I'm just going shopping, right? And then, of course, it'll code generate a little project for you. Is there any magic to this project? Of course not. But, you know, you can make your choice. So I want a Maven project. You could also get a Gradle project or just a basic Gradle config or whatever. You could choose, you know, Groovy or Java. Of course, it's just Spring, so you can use Scala or whatever you want. You know, JRuby, who cares? We're going to use the default type of jar, you know, to build our application. I'm going to go ahead and hit download. Control-C, Control-D. Goodbye. And then this is going to be okay. Oop, awkward. Okay, good. So I'm going to unzip this and go to the command line here. Can you guys see the command line? I'm going to go to the desktop, hi devox, and you'll see I've got a fairly unassuming directory structure. I have a Maven build, a simple unit test, an empty static directory inside of the resources folder, an empty templates directory inside of the resources folder, an empty property file called application. So source main resources application.properties, and then I'm going to, I also have a very boring public static void main class called application.java, which is our sort of starter point, or entry point. So I'm going to open this, and we'll look at the Maven build first, because why not? New window, thanks. By the way, show of hands, how many of you are using Eclipse? IntelliJ? That is weird. This is like the 6th conference where that's like the predominant choice. And it used to be that, you know, there's like 2 hipsters with neckbeards using IntelliJ. And it's okay. Well, it's okay. I'm an IntelliJ guy or an Eclipse guy, depending on the audience. I figured, you know, doesn't matter. Here we go. So I've got my public static void main. I have 3 annotations there. The first 2 I should hope are fairly familiar. They signal that this class is a configuration class. It has configuration beans. Public static void main, of course. You don't need any introduction to that. Spring application.run is a Spring Bootism. It gives you back an application context if you like that sort of thing. You might not. Who knows? You know. But you don't need it, right? That's why we don't assign it. But it just all that does is it's going to take this class and then use it to build up an application context for you, right? So it's going to do as much of the configuration for you as possible. And you can tell because it says @enable auto configuration. It should be a giveaway. And then with that in place, we can actually start coding. We can actually start building an application. So first things first, I want to talk to a database. We need some place to store our bookings after all. So I'm going to go ahead and comment out some stuff until later. And again, I'm trying to build this. I'm trying to build the kitchen sink. This is probably not every person's architecture. And then I need a database. I could configure a data source, a javax.sql.datasource, of course. But if Spring Boot detects that you have an embedded database like H2 or Derby or HSQL in the class path, it'll go ahead and instantiate a in-memory javax.sql.datasource for you. Of course, if you do configure a bean of type data source, then it won't. It's as simple as that. You can override at every step, right? So it'll do as much as it can for you until you say no, right? Fair enough. So it's going to go ahead and create a data source for us. So I don't have to worry about that now. I'm going to go ahead and create a booking entity here. This is standard JPA. JPA is by far the most verbose part of this discussion. I'm going to go ahead and do horrible things that you should never, ever, ever do. And I'm not kidding. Don't ever do this. Not even when you're alone. Not even when you're at home by yourself. Don't ever do this kind of stuff. I'm going to use public variables. I'm going to use setter injection. I'm going to do just awful things in the interest of keeping it on one code page. Okay. So first things first. At ID, at generated value. Okay. And then of course we're going to need a string for the booking name. So like so. There you go. Don't do that. I'm just saying. So, and then of course I need a toString method because you can't really debug something that doesn't have a toString method unless you use the debugger, and I always forget. So there's that. And we need some way to talk to the database. We have a javax.sql.data source that's been configured for us. We use Spring data repositories to sort of make our data access chores, well, to mitigate them as much as possible. I'm going to create a repository like so, at repository. And this is an interface because the implementation will be synthesized for us at runtime by Spring Data, which is configured for us by Spring Boot. This interface, JPA repository, has methods like find all, and page, and sort, and delete. Basically, CRUD style stuff, you know. If you find that you have methods on the interface that follow a certain convention, then Spring Data will automatically synthesize the queries for that as well. So I can say, for example, that I want to have a method that returns a Java 8 optional, and it returns a booking. Okay, so I can say find by booking name, string bn, like so, Java util optional. I'm using Java 8. You can use 6 or 7 or 8. How many of you are using 6, just by show of hands? I'm just curious. It's okay. By the way, Java 6 is end of life. I'm not saying that that means anything or that you should worry, but yeah. How many of you are using Java 7? Oh, you guys are so close to 8, it hurts. If you just add 1, you'll be there. At least that's what I learned in primary school. So Java 8, guys, is ridiculous. You should check it out. It's like my new favorite thing, you know. When one of those groovy weenies and those Scala hipsters comes at you with like, I've got optional, man, just shove Java 8 in their throats. They'll love it. Of course, you could use those languages too. I'm a fan. But nonetheless, Java 8 is awesome. So this query, by the by, will generate a query for you like this. Select all from booking, where booking name equals, like that. Right? This is roughly what JPA is going to generate behind the scenes. And it's going to do it based on the convention of the method name. So find by booking name, string bn. Okay? So I don't have to worry about that. And I need some data, of course. So I'm going to use some test data since we're doing an example here. I'm going to create a file called data.sql. And I'm going to say insert into booking underscore name, values, my name is Josh, that'll work. There's one. My pal Stefan, he's awesome, get that there. Dave, Dr. Sire, is one of the co-leads of the project. He should be involved as well. Phil is the other co-lead, so we'll get them both. Both of them are English, by the way. That should help. That gets me some credit, right? Let's see. Okay, so this file is called data.sql. If we had a file called schema.sql, then that would be used to create the DDL. But since we just have data.sql, it'll just load the data when the application starts up. Of course, you don't want that to happen in production, and it's dead simple to sort of, you know, cordon off certain profiles of configuration for different environments. You might have a dev and QA configuration versus a production one. But for now, we're just going to let it be a global sort of configuration namespace. So this will get loaded when the application starts up. And then we want to actually just interrogate the state of the database. So I'm going to go ahead and define a bean here. I'm going to go ahead and define a bean of type command line runner. This is a callback that Spring Boot provides that just gives you the arguments to public static void main, right? So I'm going to go ahead and return a lambda here that simply gets called with the arguments to public static void main. I'm going to say that I have a dependency on the booking repository there, so I'm going to declare a dependency on that. I'm going to use that to just, you know, don't do this at home, but hello. System.out println, hello. Cool. So that's just going to print out all the records in the database as it's loaded. I'll go ahead and run this now. While we're waiting for it to run, do you have any questions? I'm just curious. I want to know what you think about this, your thoughts. Go ahead and shout it out anytime now. Oh, you're out of time. Bummer. So let's see. Oops. I have too much on this, too much in my class path here. We need to reduce. Maven, you have failed. Spring Boot actuator, remote shell, we don't need that for now. Starter test, data JPA. Okay. You actually might have a chance now. Go ahead and, any questions, quick? No, maybe? So, did my data not get inserted? Oh, guys, you should tell me this stuff. It goes into source main resources, not in the templates folder. That's why we're having this awkwardness. That's why, not because I'm crazy or that I've lost my mind and things are going weird. There you go. So this is the output confirming that we have those 4 records in the database. It's just being picked up when the application starts up. Proof that Spring Data, our data source, and transaction management is all working. Not bad, but we can do much, much better. They say that any application of sufficient complexity eventually sends email. True. But I posit that an application of sufficient complexity eventually sprouts a REST API. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to build a REST API to talk to this data source, okay? So I'm going to say @REST controller, like so, class booking REST controller. Hello. And I'm going to go ahead and define a few methods here, maybe one for, read, string booking name, like that. Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and define another one to read them all, just because, why not? All, okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and define a variable. You can use JSR 330 if you want, JavaX inject. I'm using Spring's @autowired. This is one of those things that you should never, ever do, even when you're alone. I'm going to go ahead and use field injection because I'm trying to save space. But you should use constructor injection or setters or, just do the right thing. So, okay, return this dot booking repository dot find all. Thank you. And then here, return this dot booking repository dot find by booking name. I'm going to say map. I'm going to say or else throw new runtime exception. No booking for found. Okay, and then that's just going to return the record if it's there. Otherwise, it'll throw an exception, right? So then we need to actually map this to an endpoint. There's a lot of ways to do this. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and say that the whole controller manages one resource. It's going to be @request mapping bookings, and then I'm going to go down here and I'm going to say @request mapping booking name, right? So the booking name path variable will be mapped to this variable here, right? So by the virtue of the method name itself. So this will be equal to whatever expression you pass into that part of the path. So /bookings /foo, string booking name will be equal to foo. Okay, that's one. And then of course this one is just a good old-fashioned method. You could specify everything else. This is just Spring MVC after all. So, okay. Okay, good stuff. Let's go ahead and run that and see what we get. Any questions on this while we're talking? You might ask, for example, why I would start up a Spring MVC application from public static void main. If you did, you'd have a good answer. Spring MVC, Spring Boot rather, detects that you've got a Spring application on the class path, Spring MVC, and it'll start up embedded Tomcat for you. If you have embedded Tomcat 8 on the class path, it'll use that instead. If you have Jetty 8 on the class path, it'll use that. If you have Jetty 9 on the class path, it'll use that. And if you don't want any of this embedded business, then go ahead and just remove the library from the class path, and you can create a Servlet 3 application that you can deploy to any of these other sort of classic environments. Your web spheres and Tomcats and JBosses and so on. By the way, question. I mean, remember what I said about the hugs? I'm not kidding. I'm here for you. I'm here for you. How many of you are using WebSphere? Oh, you guys, you are victims. How many are using WebLogic? Oh. Okay, well, this would work on that too, which is interesting. So localhost bookings, voila. So there's our sort of JSON data coming back from the booking thing, you know, all of them. I can go to bookings, Josh, like that, and get my one record back. Not bad for, you know, horseshoes. So not bad, okay? We've got a very, very basic REST API babysitting a database. And if I could do it, well, you know, you guys could certainly do it. So that's a start. Let's go ahead and add a web page to it, okay? I'm going to go ahead and say class booking MVC controller. Just, oh, by the way, I forgot the other question. How many of you are using Tomcat? Just curious. Okay, whew. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and say @controller. And I'm going to say string bookings. And I'm going to go ahead and do that horrible thing I told you not to do using field injection here. Okay. And Spring MVC has this idea of a model. It's basically a glorified map of keys and values that you can dereference from your rendered template. So I'm going to say model.addAttribute, okay, bookings, like so, this.booking repository .find all. Fair enough, don't do that in production. And it's going to be bookings.html. And so I'm going to, I mean, there's no correlation between that string. You could call it whatever, right? It could be foo. I'm just going to use bookings.php to make a point. Just curious, how many of you have known somebody or known somebody who's known somebody or accidentally tripped and fell and hit somebody who used PHP at some point ever? It's out there, right? Oh, sad. Okay. Okay. So that's our little controller. We need to go ahead and create a template, obviously. So the templates live, guess where? Okay, templates. I'll go ahead and do that for you. So you say bookings.html, like so. And I'm going to go ahead and cheat. Again, the laziness, guys. It's super important that you realize how important laziness is. GitHub. Yes. So what I'm going to do here is copy an HTML template. I'm not going to write up a whole HTML page for you guys right now. Paste that in here. And this is a time leaf template, as we talked about earlier. I'll go ahead and remove the burden here, although I suppose that would work as well. This is a simple time leaf template that just renders, you know, it's going to iterate through each booking in the bookings attribute in the model and then render them here. These are HTML5, or this is an HTML5 template, but it's HTML previewable. So you could open this up with Fidelity in Dreamweaver or your browser, and it would actually look like what you've put here. It doesn't have these gnarly JSP tags inside of hate and sadness and entropy. So that works. Let's see. I've got my Maven build, by the way. Did I talk to you about the build itself? I should mention these starter palms are aggregates. They provide everything you need to work with a certain type of workload. That's what these correspond to those checkboxes, right? So when I imported Spring Boot Start a Web, this brings in Tomcat, it brings in Spring MVC, it brings in you know, file upload support and common in form validation, you know, JSR 303 and the new one, and you know, everything you're likely going to need to build a servlet-based application. You can exclude pieces if you like, but you know, you don't need to really worry about it. Same thing down here. Spring Boot Starter Data JPA brings in Hibernate, brings in all those other pieces. This is going to go ahead and bring in the time leaf piece, right? So I'm going to go ahead and use time leaf. There is now Spring Boot 1.1, which just got released. I think we just dropped it last week. So Spring Boot 1.1 supports FreeMarker, Velocity, and Groovy server pages in addition to time leaf and JSP. So again, just add the right jar to the class path, and you get the configuration file of your format, you know, template of your choosing. Let's see. So this is going to say, return the view called bookings, gesund. It's going to return the view called bookings. It's going to resolve it based on a pre-configured view resolver. It's going to look for source main resources templates. But of course, if you configure your own view resolver, then you can override this. You can put them wherever you want, right? But by default, it'll do something useful. So bookings.html, that's this right here. Let's see, run. This is so awkward. If only we had some sort of live, oh wait, we do. We'll talk about that later. Okay. Bookings. So that still works. Yay. And then go here, .php, and you have sadness. Oh, booking.id, right, because that's not a public field in my super gnarly entity. Reload. Again, you might use getters for this kind of stuff, you know, or accessors. Voila. Okay, so there you go. So very, very simple example. Nothing particularly fancy, but you get a template, and you get, you know, now you have a template and a REST API babysitting a database. And I would say that's not bad, right? Yes, no, maybe, so far? That bad, okay. But how many of you have read Michael Nygaard's amazing, epic, ridiculously cool book, Release It? Oh, you guys, that's awesome. I love this community. That book is really good. It's awesome. And the punchline is sort of, I mean, it says a lot. The punchline is, feature complete does not equal production ready. There's a large distance between having an application that matches features and being in production, right? Being in production is a very different beast altogether. You need to have an application that's hooked up to monitoring. It's got to be hooked up to security. It's got to be hooked up to metrics. If you can't measure it, if you can't monitor it and audit it, then you can't improve it. You can't have a baseline. And Spring Boot is optimized for this. Actually, a very common use case with Spring Boot is something called microservices. Has the hype around microservices kind of inundated you guys here as well? Microservices is how many microservices? Anybody hear of it? Oh, okay. So it's this idea of, you know, Unix style composability for services based on REST or messaging and so on, right? So you build the smallest service that could possibly work, and then you compose it. It's like SOA without the soap. You know, it's SOA with REST or AMQP or whatever. And there are some small mom and pop companies in the United States that are using Spring Boot for this use case. How many of you have heard of Netflix? Netflix, okay. Or Ticketmaster. Ticketmaster, anybody here? Okay, I mean, these are just some small companies that are doing this sort of architecture, and they're using Spring Boot. Hey, no, we need the power. So that is a very, very good idea. But you want to build a service as quickly as possible. You want to get it off the line as quickly as possible. How many of you have ever seen, there's a great talk by a guy named Fred George on microservices. Have you guys heard of Fred George? He's actually lives here in the UK. Brilliant guy, super, super smart. And he talks about his team's struggle to sort of decide upon the size, the correct one size for microservices. And he said that they decided upon this sort of almost arbitrary number of 100 lines of code. Well, 100 lines of code, of course, is language dependent, but it does sort of give you kind of a yardstick. He says that if you have a service that's about 100 lines of code, then even if it's broken and somebody did something horrible, you could scrap it and rewrite it, you know, in an afternoon. It's not a big deal. It's 100 lines of code. And if you compose services based on this sort of really, really small metric, then, you know, people in the team can pick up anything, right? In fact, you could, if it's REST, then you could switch it out, you know? Maybe you can use, maybe you decide to start with a node.js, and then you decide that you actually want to do scale, so you go to something like Spring or whatever, you know? Throw those pieces away. No big deal. It's just 100 lines of code. So I think that's very interesting, but what that implies is that you can't afford to waste time scripting around the edges. All this other stuff that is very important for production shouldn't be in that metric. You want to have that out of the gate, right? You want to have that done for you because you have things to do. And so Spring Boot is definitely optimized for that. So we'll look at this now. Just making sure I have the right things on the class path. Spring Boot. Right, so this is the actuator, okay? As I understand it, and I'm not I-A-N-A-P. I am not a physicist. As I understand it, an actuator is something that, it's like the one-inch punch of physics, you know? It gives you a lot more bang for the buck, you know? It's a catalyst. It gives you the ability to take a little bit of energy and make a lot more. So Spring Boot actuator does just that. Just by being on the class path, you get a lot of stuff oriented towards production readiness. I didn't need to actually restart. I didn't need to shut down the application. I could have just left it as is. So I'm going to go over here, metrics, okay? So the metrics endpoint is an endpoint that tells you about the running state of your application. It says, you know, here's how much memory you've got, how much is free, how many processors, the uptime, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can tie this into Nagios or New Relic or Hyperic or whatever, you know, anything you want. It gives you information about, you know, how many threads and the classes and so on. If I go to the beans endpoint here, this gives you a listing of all the beans that you've defined in your Spring context, or in point of fact, the beans that Spring Boot has defined for you. Perhaps I want to go to I want to figure out the application's health, right? So there's a default health endpoint that tells you the current database stack, if you have one. And we have default ones for common cases like RabbitMQ and for Solr and for Redis and RabbitMQ and whatever, but by default we try and do a good job. So here we're going to show you the current database stack as well as the result of the validation query that our connection pool, which we already configured for you, is returning. So hello:1 is select 1. That's the validation query going against our database. Again, you can override all of this, right? So a couple things you might want to override. Well, how about the metrics and the endpoints themselves, right? In production, you probably don't want that hanging out in the wild, right? Useful though it might be for debugging. And so we try and make as much as possible overridable through properties. And if you want to see a enumeration of all the possible properties for the application, go to the /config props endpoint, and you can see property values that you can put that will disable or toggle or customize the way the application works. In my case, I want to get rid of the beans endpoint. So I'm going to find the beans in here. It's going to be beans endpoint dot enabled is going to be false. Okay, so I'm going to go to my little property file, which is the empty thing that we had here before, and I'm going to say false. You can use any property file you want if you import it, using @property_source, the annotation, but by default it'll pick up application.properties and load that for you. And then the other thing I might want to do is override the health endpoint. Maybe the default health endpoints that Spring Boot has provided are not up to snuff. Maybe you need something better, and that's fine. I mean, we don't want you to be hamstrung. So I'm going to go ahead and define a new one here. The other thing you might change, for example, is which port the application lives on. I think this would work. I haven't checked the new one yet, but it should be the same. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to say, okay, well, I want my own health endpoint. Bean health indicator, like so. It doesn't have to be named anything. You can name the method, whatever. It's the type that matters, right? So very, very important. And I'm going to define an instance of type health indicator. Health indicator is a so-called functional interface in Java 8. So it has one job, to return a health object. And you can, of course, override that. So I'm going to say return, or rather health dot devox for life build. Okay, so that's just going to return a status that says devox for life based on the state of the application. You might check the NASDAQ. You might check the horoscope. You might check your own infrastructure services. Who cares? I mean, this is your chance to shine. Run this application again. Any questions while we're doing that? I mean, this could take a good 2 seconds. Anybody? Anybody? Oh, you guys. Okay, so what do? We disabled the beans endpoint. That shouldn't work anymore. And of course, the port is wrong. So first 8,000. And beans is still there. Did I get the property wrong? That's awkward. That could be, but let me make sure I'm config props. Hello. Let's see. Beans. Endpoints that, son of a gun. Endpoints.beans dot enabled. So that was the first thing I did wrong. Okay, sorry about that. We'll see it work in the next couple seconds here. But you notice that the port got changed. So a lot of the common things that you want to override are easily changed through properties. If you want to write code and override the whole object graph, for the respective component, you're more than free to do that. Obviously, you saw I could do that with the health endpoint itself. Is that up and running? Okay. So beans, like so. Good, nothing working. But if I go to health, that should be this new devox for life thing, right? So that's an example of customizing the application without exerting too much effort, okay? This is okay. This is a good start, but we can do better. I think you can actually do a lot better. So if you go to the terminal here, I'm going to go ahead and open up JMX. By default, Spring Boot's going to export everything. Where did it put it this time? I think that's it. Connect. Insecure connection, sure. mbeans, org spring framework. Here are the endpoints that we have. Same endpoints, same data, right? You can override all these different endpoints, all this information. So we want to look at the health endpoint here. I'm going to go ahead and use the operations. I'm going to go ahead and say, get the data. And there's our devox for life JMX endpoint, if you wanted to use that, for example. One of my favorite ways to look at the data and to look at the application is to use the crash hub shell, okay? So I'm going to go pom.xml, and you can see did I enable that? Nope, I disabled it for posterity. So I'm going to go ahead and open that and reload. And that's how many of you have heard of Crash Hub, Crash D, whatever? It's a really, really cool Java project that we've integrated. It gives you the ability to sort of create a SSH session. And when you do that, this gives you a default password. I can override all of this by using Spring Security. If I want to tie this to my identity provider like OAuth or Active Directory or LDAP or PAM or CAS or Kerberos or whatever, there's a Spring Security implementation and integration that you can use. But by default, since we haven't done any of that, it'll give us a default password that it vomits out in the shell there with default username user 127.0.0 awkward .1. Type in the password, hit go. This is important. So I want you guys, I would like to think that this amazing ASCII artwork was the first thing that we worked on. I don't know that it was, but it should have been if it wasn't. I love good ASCII artwork, and I know that the hipsters do too. The kids today, they need the ASCII artwork. They need it. They won't even look at the Java if you don't have the ASCII. So we have the ASCII. If you don't like the ASCII, you can override it in that Spring application object. It's important that you know that you have a choice. You know, Spring is all about choice. But I think it's really good. And I want you to know that somebody worked very hard on this. So if you don't appreciate it, then, you know, I mean, just do whatever you want. It's fine. You'll be okay. Okay, so let's see. Help. I'm going to go ahead and ask for help here. And it's going to say, okay, here are your options. Here are the things you can do. I can do simple stuff like JVM type, Java type, java.lang.string. And it gives you the reverse compile, the reverse compile the type on the class path, for example, simple stuff like that. I can say system prop ls, right? That gives you all the properties on the environment. Again, these are mirrors, if you will, of a lot of the same data that you could get from the REST endpoint, right? So all this stuff is not particularly new. What else do I have? I can say help again. I can say mail. I don't want to mail anybody right now. Endpoint. Invoke. Okay. And I'm going to say health endpoint. Okay. There's our DevOps for life data coming back from the endpoint there. My favorite thing inside the shell is the dashboard. This is Java top. Java top and properties. And then down here you've got a Java 8 specific and friendly version of your memory, right? So you can see the heap, the non-heap, the code cache, and the metaspace. It's a little weird because of the terminal and the resolution. I wonder if I can make that work. If you're on Java 6 or 7, however, you'll get permgen, of course, right? So it'll work based on the environment you're in. Okay. So did I forget anything? Did I forget anything? I mean, I forgot. There's a lot more to talk about, obviously. We could tie in security. We could actually tie secure our REST API behind OAuth so that a JavaScript client or an iOS phone or an Android phone could consume it using access tokens very quickly. We could tie in Solr or Elasticsearch or whatever. I'm going to demystify how this is all working so you guys don't leave here with those unanswered questions I was worried about. So that @enable auto configuration, this is where the magic is. This tells Spring Boot to look in the class path and define any spring.factories. There you go. It's going to look in the class path and find any metainf /spring.factories, I think. And we're looking for Spring Boot auto configure. Thank you. And then when you look at this file, you'll see a comma delimited list. It starts with org spring framework boot auto configure .enable auto configuration equals, and then it gives you these all these different auto configuration classes, right? And these are the configuration classes that we've written for you, so that you don't have to, right? This is what I meant by having somebody from the Spring team pair program with you. But you might look at the names, and you might kind of wonder, like, Flyway. This is a database migration tool that we support, right? If it's on the class path. We have Solr, supported for you. MongoDB, JBA, Elasticsearch, Spring Batch, JMS and JMX. HornetQ actually is supported now. ActiveMQ and HornetQ. Liquibase as well. So we have two different types of auto configurations for database migration tools. You don't want all of these things on the class path, right? This could be crazy talk. So, Facebook and LinkedIn and Solr and Velocity and just everything. Even the HTTP server that we used itself is here. HTTP message converters, WebMVC, auto configuration, etc. So the question is, what does all this stuff do, right? So looking up a class, go ahead and download the sources, Wi-Fi being what it is. Good. So you can see this class is bleeding red. Look at all this. These are types that are not on the class path. So you don't want Spring to load those classes and then, groovy, thanks. Thanks, boss. You don't want Spring to load this class and then try and evaluate all these beans, especially if you don't have the types on the class path. And so we guard everything with these at conditionals, right? This is a Spring forism. It's a annotation that you can use to define a bean. So here's the bean, and here are the different types of meta conditionals, right? These are just annotations that are themselves annotated with Spring for's at condition, which takes as its argument a condition literal reference, right? And the condition literal it tests whatever. You could test the lottery, you could test the horoscope, you could test anything, right? Including whether you have other beans already on the class path, right? So for example, that database that we created, it only gets created if there are no other data sources in the application context. You can also test things like, do we have a type on the class path? Does the rabbit template class and the channel class exist on the class path? And we don't do a class.for name, obviously, because that would be weird. And usually if you have a type that you can't reference, literal in the code, you get into trouble. So we actually use bytecode checking. We use in this particular case. So this actually works. This will look at the class path and say, does the rabbit template exist? If not, then none of this gets evaluated. You don't get a default connection factory. You don't get a default rabbit template to consume or JMS template. You don't get any of that stuff, right? So this is how we can do things for you, but get out of your way as quickly as you need us to, right? So, for example, in the connection factory example, if there's no other bean of type rabbit, this is the rabbit MQ connection factory. If there's no other bean in the context of that same type, then this configuration class will be invoked and this definition will get created for you. And by the way, see all these property checks here? We're actually checking the config object, which is coming from up here. We're saying that we want Spring Boot to map the properties in the property file to our POJOs, right? So we have a rabbit properties object that has fields and things like this, and these are going to be mapped for us based on the prefixed properties called spring.rabbitmq.asterisk. So these get mapped to the properties on the object. It's a type-safe way of coercing properties into objects and then using that in the configuration to sort of set things up for you. So any questions on that? I see looks of horror and weirdness. Yes?
Is Spring Boot, is it really intended for running with an embedded like Tomcat or?
Why not? Yeah, sure. I mean, you can use whatever you want, of course, but
You can also use it on like a separate Tomcat.
yeah, of course. You can just
How much of the sort of the health stuff and all those other sort of services do you lose?
none of that. So you keep it all. So let me show you a couple things here. If I go to the desktop here, okay, go to the High DevOps folder, Maven clean install, as fast as we can, run. Okay, run the unit test, look at that ASCII artwork. Okay, fail, unit test is failing, whatever. Okay, come on, let go. CD target, what you have here are two different jars, right? The first jar is the original one. This is a Maven build plugin, which you can just as easily remove if you like. The one code page that we've written up in this session is about 8 kilobytes in jar size, right? That's actually the manifest and meta-inf and all that. And then the build that we actually get from our build is this guy, right? And that's actually 35 megs. So if I do java-jar bookings, whatever, what I get is embedded Tomcat. I get the entire application. I get the SSH shell. I get all of that stuff, oh, it's already running in the other port. So that's one way to go. And then you can deploy those jar. You can do java-jar and just run it anywhere. And actually, you can, like for example, if you go here, github.com, the Spring REST stack, and then go to application, like so. And it's going to be, thank you. Here I've got, for example, cores, right? I'm actually saying this is SSL. So I'm actually setting up embedded HTTPS right here, right? This is a bean that I'm registering that will be called by embedded Tomcat, and it'll set up HTTPS. So when you do java-jar, you can access things from HTTPS as well as HTTP. You can override all that, and actually I can set up cores and all that stuff as well. So you can do anything you want from embedded, but you don't have to. If you go to the build file, like this, get rid of that build plugin, and then go to your code and add extends Spring boot servlet initializer. You get a callback called configure, and all I'm going to do is say return application.config, or sources rather, and tell Spring Boot that I want it to find this guy, and then that will be a servlet 3 bootstrap. It'll actually extend servlet 3 initializer hook and give you a servlet 3 environment application. You go back to the Maven build and change the build type, of course. Why does IntelliJ think it's got a problem but not tell me where? Anyway, you go back to the build type here and you add the packaging to be war, and then it's just a standard war. And in fact, I put a blog about how to deploy it to Tomcat, to Cloud Foundry, to Heroku, and to JBoss. You know, so you can show the same app runs everywhere. It's a blog called Deploying Spring Boot Applications. The grammar errors and the all that stuff is mine. So this is actually very old now, March of this year. But anyway, thank you guys. If you have questions, I'm here for you. Thank you, and have a wonderful show. There's a. What'd you guys think, by the way? Yes, no, maybe? Up, thumbs up? Okay, cool. Tell your friends. There's a BOF tonight, guys. The Spring BOF. I'd love to see you guys. If you have those unanswered questions I was worried about, don't hesitate to bring them to the BOF tonight.